Senator, the first question. You've been overwhelmingly re-elected. Jabari Brisport, Farah Sufran Forest, Marcela Mitanas, Zoran Mamdani, and Emily Gallagher also won their primary. It's such a victory that Ryan Green, the journalist for The Incept, said that the Democratic Socialists of America are going to take over New York City. What is your impression about that? And if so, how do you see that shift growing outside of New York, and what will New York's role be in that shift?
So I think the context is really helpful. The political context is really helpful for understanding what's happening. Going back even to 2016, when Senator Bernie Sanders, of course, ran openly as a Democratic Socialist for the Democratic nomination, and ran a really inspiring campaign, inspired millions of people around the country, including a lot of working class people and people who ordinarily are disillusioned with politics, myself included. And naturally, because he ran as a Democratic Socialist, the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Committee, was openly hostile to him, and by extension to his supporters and to so many Americans who, for the first time ever, or for the first time in a long time, were becoming civically engaged. And so ultimately, of course, Hillary Clinton won the Democratic primary and Trump won the general election. And it was devastating. It was a devastating result. And for a lot of people, particularly in New York, but really across the country, the result of that election, first of all, it motivated thousands of new members to join the Democratic Socialists of America, which saw this huge membership boom, grew exponentially and has continued to steadily grow since then, in the nearly 4 years since then. But also it motivated a lot of people to say, okay, well, there was this stark contrast between the political reality that many of us see in our communities and experience in our lives locally versus the result that we saw with Trump winning the presidential election. So it motivated a lot of people to think, well, if I'm going to be able to affect change, then I need to become more actively involved in local politics. And I was one of those people as well. I had been involved in electoral campaigns, before 2016, and had been involved in Bernie Sanders' campaign. But I saw the result of the election, then also recognized that it was going to actually have an existential impact on the most vulnerable people in our country, particularly, of course, our undocumented neighbors. As soon as Trump was sworn into office, he was already signing executive orders coming after undocumented people, coming after the Affordable Care Act, which is not universal health care, unfortunately, but did at least extend access to health care to millions of people, right? So trying to undo all of this, and people began to organize locally and at the state level to fight back. And so fast forward to 2018, that's when I first ran, right, openly as a Democratic Socialist, and defeated a longtime incumbent. This time around, we're seeing the outcome of about 4 years of people consistently becoming more and more actively involved in local politics, and people becoming more involved in certainly the Democratic Socialists of America, but also at the same time, the issues that affect people's everyday lives are being exacerbated. And that was the case even before the pandemic, right? It was the case because of capitalism, right? It would have been true even if we had a Democratic president, but it's all the more apparent and severe when we have a president like Donald Trump. And so with that, more and more people have been motivated to run for office. And to run either openly as democratic socialists or, sorry, my dog is distracting. I may move to another room so that he doesn't do this. Sorry, one moment. Let's see. Right, so it's motivated more people to run for office, and it's people like, certainly myself, Jabari Brisport, Faris Dufront Forest, Marcella Mitanes, but also people across the country. And they're not only running, we're not just seeing, more competitive races, but they're winning their primaries, including in red states like Tennessee, for example. We just saw a Black woman challenging an entrenched incumbent for U.S. Senate, no less. So I'm only a state senator, but running for a federal position, ran openly as a democratic socialist, had the support of the Democratic Socialists of America, raised something like $8,000, $9,000 total,
That's
which is
right, yeah.
just absolutely, I mean, that's like pocket change when in the context of a Senate or congressional race. And she won her election, right? So it isn't even just happening in New York. The reason that these campaigns are succeeding, despite other metrics of strength in an electoral campaign lacking, right, like fundraising or institutional support, the reason that we are still winning these elections is because we are speaking directly to people's needs and their pain, so socially, economically, and proposing and actually fighting for real transformative solutions. And those solutions, all of those solutions are related to or really entrenched in an anti-capitalist worldview. And the skeptics in all of these races, my race in 2018, there was certainly plenty of red baiting. There was even in the time between elections, people, being very alarmed that I would publicly identify as a Marxist. This response is typical of the liberal elite, but it doesn't resonate for the everyday working class people who are voting in elections, right? What they either are completely, they have a positive view of socialism, or they're sort of uninterested in whether or not someone identifies as democratic socialist, and more interested in what your answer is to the fact that they can't afford to go to the doctor when they're sick, or whether or not you're talking about the root causes of us losing 5,000 people in Brooklyn alone. Not in New York, it's got to be more than 100,000 people at this point to COVID-19, right? And so many people not having adequate health care or child care, so many people being unemployed. All of these problems are really a crisis of capitalism, and people recognize that those of us who are running as democratic socialists are advocating for real solutions to those problems.
Yeah, okay, you mentioned COVID-19. We are amid a global health crisis. In the USA, the death toll is now above 160,000. New York is severely hit. Do you think that people decided to vote for socialist candidates because they support Medicare for all?
Yes. While I don't think it's the only reason, I think it's a very compelling reason. Additionally, there are some candidates who are running to the left of incumbents, who would identify as progressive, who support Medicare for all, and who maybe you could better characterized as like left liberal. They're not even entirely aligned with us, and yet even they are recognizing that our for-profit healthcare system has just been a devastating failure. And until we have universal healthcare in the United States, we are going to we're not only going to see just this overall devastation when there's a pandemic, but we're going to see this egregious racial disparity in the impact, right? So the communities that I represent are predominantly people of color. The majority of my district is Black and Latino New Yorkers, and we've seen the highest rate of deaths from COVID-19 in East New York, for example, a neighborhood that I represent, very close to where I live. And it isn't, it's not just by chance, of course, that Black and brown New Yorkers are dying at a much higher rate than white New Yorkers, even if you account for economic status. It's about racism in access to healthcare, in the way that our hospitals are funded, in the fact that we have fewer hospitals that are well funded in our neighborhoods, and predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, and our hospitals that we have here instead, public hospitals, are their funding, their Medicaid funding is on the chopping block for every state budget, city budget, and are hurt the most when the federal government makes Medicaid cuts or cuts to healthcare. So people are really hurting, and they're also recognizing that people who used to not really take public health seriously, and maybe had more of a personal responsibility view of healthcare, are recognizing that the importance of public health, certainly in the context of this pandemic, and that really, I think, drives people toward solidarity, and the solidarity that's really necessary in order to support universal healthcare, and not healthcare that's dependent on your immigration status or your employment status, particularly in a moment when so many people are unemployed. We have the highest unemployment rates in the United States right now that we've seen since the Great Depression, so almost 100 years. I just think that there was already a growing movement in support of Medicare for all, but there's no doubt that this pandemic, and certainly in New York, because we've really been the epicenter in the United States of the pandemic, it's motivating people to support it, and it's becoming a very important distinction between democratic socialists, or even just progressives, and liberals or centrists in the Democratic Party.
Let's talk about the presidential election. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib won their primary, so did Jamal Bowman and Cory Bush. Besides, Joe Biden is leading the latest polls. However, you consider yourself a Marxist. What is your opinion about Joe Biden? Are you going to vote for him? And according to you, what's the better way to defeat President Trump? Do you think that elected socialists could shift the policy of the Biden administration?
I think back with this question, I reflect on the outcome of the election in 2016. Of course, there's this two-party system in the United States that really demands in every state, certainly in the general election, that you are voting for either a Democrat or a Republican, or you're casting a sort of protest vote for a third party candidate. And looking back at 2016, I reluctantly, for the general election, after supporting Senator Sanders for the primary, I supported Hillary Clinton because I felt that I would much rather be organizing for change under a Democratic president who at least would have more humane policies toward our most vulnerable communities than the alternative, than President Trump. And I still feel that way, in that I remember how so much of our organizing work locally at the state level has been dedicated just to protecting people and fighting for their survival, in a way that the capacity that we've had to dedicate to that would much better be dedicated to fighting for transformative change, like universal health care, Medicare for all, right? Change such as completely forgiving student debt and tuition-free public education across the country. Things that democratic socialists have really been leading the way on. Fighting for a Green New Deal. We would have more capacity and strength to fight for those things, and truly just a better chance of passing them if we had a Democratic president. So personally, I plan to vote for Joe Biden. I'm very concerned that we will see a similar result that we saw in 2016. And meaning that President Trump will be reelected. And then at the same time, we could probably expect people to only become angrier with the Democratic Party for once again failing to nominate and support an inspiring Democratic candidate who not only gains institutional support, but within the Democratic Party, but also is able to motivate and earn the trust and the votes of people who sat out last presidential election in 2016. Even, I know these people, all of us. I would say anyone actively involved in politics in the United States knows someone who either stayed home in 2016 because they weren't motivated to vote for Hillary Clinton, or someone who voted for Trump who would have voted, like some of my own family members who would have voted, have more of a populist political orientation, who would have voted for Bernie Sanders had he been on the ballot instead. And I'm unfortunately not convinced that those same people are going to be motivated to vote for Joe Biden. But I actually hope, I still hope that that's not the case. I would much rather us have a Democratic president and be fighting for these policies like Medicare for all, Green New Deal, under a Joe Biden presidency than under a Trump presidency.
Let's focus on the Democratic Party. In the 60s, true writers of Dissent magazine said that the main arena in which a radical coalition can work is the Democratic Party. What's your opinion? Do you think that elected socialists are in capacity to shift the Democratic Party on the left? Or are you one of those who want to make DSA a political party?
I think that we really need to be creating a blueprint for a new left party in the United States. And I think this for a few reasons. One, I do think that the Democratic Party, or at least people who run on the Democratic Party, the demographic is changing, the political orientation is moving leftward, and that's a positive thing. Certainly it's a positive thing within a system where these two parties dominate. Even though I identify, of course, as a democratic socialist, and I organize with democratic socialists, I still am in the Democratic Party's conference within the state legislature, which is sort of a testament to how, at least by that metric, the Democratic Party is shifting leftward. The problem is, in the United States, because of the way our political parties have functioned, especially at the national level, the vast majority of people, even people who are actively involved in politics or are elected officials like myself, we don't have any affection for the party whose party line we run on every election, or who we are, paper members of. And that is what leads me to believe that even if the Democratic Party, the members, I should say, of the Democratic Party begin to skew more leftward, it is not going to be a mechanism for social change in this country, the way that a party gaining seats in a legislature in another country, where parties just function differently than they do in the United States, that could be a mechanism for social change and the left and democratic socialists taking power. Inherently, the Democratic Party is still a capitalist party, in that they're actually still very similar to the Republican Party in fundamental ways, in their worldview and the way that they think society should function. It's very telling that recently leadership in the Democratic National Committee, in preparation for the National Convention, they excluded Medicare for All. Deliberately, they voted to exclude Medicare for All from the party's platform. That to me just demonstrates a party where participation and leadership is concentrated at the very top, directly related to who has the resources to participate, who can sort of buy participation. And it indicates that they're just really out of touch with the majority of Americans. So I think that even as it's strategic for many of us to run on the Democratic Party line, certainly to work with people who are registered Democrats or in Democratic leadership, we really should be building a true left, sort of a labor party, a working class party, an anti-capitalist party, a democratic socialist party in the United States, through which not only would it be an alternative to the hegemony, the two-party system, but it also would be a party that just fundamentally would function differently than these other two parties. A party where it's like small d democratic, where people who register with this party actually have the agency to, equitably to make decisions for the party, or inform the party's decisions at every level of government. So essentially, yes, there can be a positive impact of change within the Democratic Party, but I don't think it should be at all a primary goal of the left. I think it's sort of futile to think that changing the Democratic Party is going to, certainly that it's going to overthrow capitalism or change our society into one where people are valued over profit.
Senator, here's my last question. AOC and Bernie Sanders worked for the Biden's Unity Task Force, and on some issues, the results are quite disappointing. Once again, I think about Medicare for All. The Unity Task Force wants Medicare for those who turn 60 instead of 65 today. On the same issue, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton proposed Medicare for those who turn 55. Why this lack of ambition? Did Bernie Sanders get once again defeated by the establishment?
Yes, I think that while it was important for the Sanders campaign and Sanders surrogates, delegates like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, it was important for them to take advantage of the opportunity to inform this unity platform, right? With the Biden campaign, it's better than the alternative. It definitely didn't achieve some of our just most fundamental needs. Our sort of red lines were not honored. If Medicare for All is one of our top priorities, which I think it absolutely must be. And I think that indicates that in this unity task force, the institutional Democratic Party that supported Joe Biden still had the upper hand, still really had more weight than our people, than the left. And so it's sort of unsurprising that this was the outcome. And it does speak to the need, if that outcome and that process, the Unity Task Force, is sort of a picture of what it looks like for the left to fight for representation or more influence within the Democratic Party. If that outcome of this platform is a picture of what that struggle would look like, then it really makes the case for us to be focused on a more long-term goal of building a party that is truly a working class party that represents the vast majority of Americans, instead of being dominated by people who are comfortable with the capitalist system.